Shukran Gazilan. And thank you very much to all of you for all the arrangements here. It's nice to see sunshine, coming from the west coast of Oregon. I mean, I haven't seen sun in like 9 months, literally. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank, of course, everyone associated with all the work you've done in putting this together, Nada, and Sarah Rogers, and AMCA, and all the others, and AMCA, and also the generosity of those here at AUB. Dean Patrick Debris, it's a pleasure to meet you, and of course, Professor Kassab, and for all you have done in these arrangements, and of course also the generosity of the donors in providing support for this conference. Let me just pull up the images here real quick. So with that, I will, let me just pull this up. I'm giving myself away as I'm a Windows person, I guess. Good, okay. What I'd like to do today is talk about the manifestation, the problem of the '67 war in Egyptian artistic discourse and practice. And I think that the '67 war represents an intellectual break, of course, has been advocated by prominent intellectuals, including most notably Abdullah Larawi and his Crisis of the Intellectual, which appeared in French in 1974. I argue, crises do indeed provoke critical responses, but artistic production in Egypt, both before and after the war, also reflected critical currents underway in Egypt, in narratives of Arab arts, and particularly in Egyptian narratives. The '67 war was posed as an endpoint in Mohsen Mohammed Atia's Gayat al-Fan Dirasa Falsafia al-Aqdiyya, which should be the aim of art, a philosophical and critical study, published in 1991. For Atia, he concluded that essentially the '67 war was he ended it with his discussion in that book with a comparative discussion of Egyptian modernist arts with the writing of Ramses Yunan. Now, Yunan is a very key figure in Egyptian art and writing in this period. By ending his study with his study of Egyptian aesthetic discourse with Yunan, whose death in December of 1966 presaged the later crisis of the June War, Atia presents 1967 as a kind of culminating point of continuity, has a kind of Hegelian sense to it, I believe, but he really evades a broader comparative inquiry of the construction of aesthetics and ideology. Atia is a very prolific writer, teaches at Helwan University. He's a really major figure in terms of writing on aesthetics in Egypt, and anyone reading Egyptian arts and aesthetics has to kind of, at some point, confront Atia that way. A more suggestive approach is found in Izz al-Din Naguib's Al-Tawja al-Ijtima'i lil-Finan al-Misri al-Mu'asir, social orientation or the social direction of the contemporary Egyptian artists. That was published in 1997. I think Naguib follows from Larawi in many ways. Naguib distinctly recognized the '67 war and its destructive consequences that provoked specific reactions among artists, intellectuals in the following decade. Naguib posits that the Egyptian national project of modernization, embodied in the High Dam project, with its formal sponsorship by the state of artists, had prompted a critical reflection that following the war allowed a number of writers, artists, modes of documentary interpretations of civil society and its discontent. In doing so, Naguib utilized Larawi's formulation of a second nakhta to explain the expansive art and cultural programs of the state of the Nasser period. Now, in the year before the '67 war, of course, Egyptian civil society had undergone a series of crises centered on the state and peasant labor. The engagement of the Egyptian army in the Yemen civil war burdened the general population, conscription into the military service. It imposed an emotional, physical toll. Meanwhile, the state's promotion of the High Dam at the same time, this large construction project, mobilized thousands of migrant workers, the Tarahu, migrant workers into service on the dam project and the affiliated land reclamation projects. There's very good studies on just how extensive this problem was. The government was pressured for an official inquiry into the assassination of the peasant labor leader Salah al-Qad, who was killed by hired hitmen of the large landowners in the Delta village at Kamshish in April '65. These are very famous incidents in the year leading up to the war. The state also exerted an overt authoritarian policy, carrying out the show trial execution of the Muslim brother and Islamist intellectual Sayyid Qutb. All of this is occurring in the year before the war breaks out. In the same year, too, Egypt's most prominent artists and spokesman for an art of social engagement, Abdel Hadi al-Ghazar and Ramses Yunan, also died. So this is really kind of a point at which there's a transitional period in the arts and also for the question of the position of the state and state power. So I think in Egyptian art history for the period 52 through 66 needs to be contrasted with the position of Egyptian society that emerges after 66 and certainly the impact of the 67 war. After the war, the culmination of social and economic pressures, Cold War power politics, forced the state to realign its corporatist strategy in favor of the Sadat regime's shift to internal repression, its open door strategy, very famous open door strategy of accommodation of the West. So the arts of the surviving members of the contemporary art group, this older generation that have taken very interesting positions that I know Dina and Alexandra, a number of you here are working on, is sort of confronted with this problem at this point. And I think you see in artists, in writing, in theater, in drama, in filmmaking responses. The writing of Naguib Sarour following the '67 war, it emphasizes discontent with the failure of the state and its policies. We can see this in Gamal al-Saghini's sculptural interpretations of this disquiet. I'll show a slide later in sculptures like Simple People of 1970, or Sonala Ibrahim's subversive writing of the state's managerial abuse of labor conditions on the Aswan Dam in his Nejma, Augustus, or Star of August, published in 1974. We can also see this sort of discontent in two films made by Yusuf Shaheen between the '67 war and the October War of '73. These were his documentary Anaswa Anil, or I think they translated as distributed in the States as The People on the Dam, or the People on the Nile. That documentary by Shaheen was produced in '68 to '70, but only released in 1970 as a critical documentary, hardly ever seen. I have not been able to get hold of it to see it. I think it's been 2 showings at Columbia, maybe at Cornell. If anybody's, it's an important documentary from that, but I just want to point this at multiple forms of this kind of discourse taking place. And also, of course, his better-known expose of black market corruption following the '67 war in Al-Asfar, the Sparrow, which shows the effect of black market corruption on the residents of an Upper Egyptian town in his '72 production of that film. But of course, it wasn't released till after this, till about 1974. Now, what framed the internal crisis of Egyptian society in the year leading up to the '67 war, I argue, was the Southern question. I obviously follow, as a student of Peter Graham's, I obviously would follow a lot of the discussion that's come out about how important the Southern question is. And I really think we see this in the participation of Southern artists, Upper Egyptian artists in this period in Egypt, in raising a new kind of look view. Part of Nasser regime's policy for the arts included these artists from Upper Egypt and the inflection of Southern Egyptian culture that impresses itself upon the arts in this period. This presented a critical impulse against the ruling strategy of using the Southern problem by the state to play regions against each other and to sort of deflect a broader struggle between rich and poor that was taking place. The development of Naguib Sarour's trilogy in this period, Yasin and Bahia, begun in '65 but not completed until 1972, presents the Egyptian peasant in a narrative that originates from the struggle of a single village in Beirut, based on this historical massacre of peasants in 1951, and he bases that as his novel around these characters from that actual historical incident, and he then traces them historically through the 60s. He kind of infers the Camp Sheesh massacre of Salah Maclad in his second part of his trilogy, and in his third play of the trilogy, he has these characters moving to Upper Egypt to work on the Aswan Dam as Tarahli workers, as migrant workers. So here, another form of literary manifestation of this general problem of Upper Egypt as the war breaks out. The play ends with his characters of the novel ends with the jets of the 1967 war, the Israeli jets overhead at the end of that novel. Well, he began the work during a period of state-sponsored patronage in which artists largely from the Delta or Cairo were sent up to Upper Egypt to sort of study the problem of relocation, of modernization by the dam project. But he finishes his trilogy during a time when he's fallen out of favor with the state. And I think this reflects a kind of problem of patronage, a sort of counter-reaction by these artists against state policy, including Al-Ghazar earlier, or the writer Sunal Ibrahim. But what is the relation between painting, graphic works, writing as intertextual narratives of labor and the problem of state formation at this time? And how can we discuss this together? Well, one of the ways is to look at the earlier works from drawings and sequence of sort of studies that Al-Ghazar made here, these sort of preparatory drawings that show up in his very famous paintings that he performed later. I've just chosen one of these pen and ink drawings from his Dynamics of the High Dam series. These are reproduced in Roussillon's sort of catalog résumé of Al-Ghazar's life. These are apparently just private drawings, and so you have to look for the subversive often in his private drawings rather than what actually got exhibited that way. He transforms the dam here from an engineering marvel into a critique of the exploitation of labor. Several workers are seen entombed or encased alive in the scaffolding beneath the encasing cement of the imposing structure. You can just kind of see these entombed figures down here. This would raise resonance with some of his other drawings from much earlier periods where he shows massacres in a number of his other drawings. And so we see this kind of questioning of what this project really entails. As we examine the drawing further, the outline of a face is apparent. This is eyes made of concrete, reinforced structures here. We can see here the outline of a face that's apparent. Its eyes made of concrete reinforced blocks, its nose of another slab, and what emerges is an enormous gargantuan head of machinery parts and construction elements. The pentagonal colossus of concrete and human anticipates the painting of the high dam that he made in the same year. The metamorphosis of human into colossus of the concrete giant in the drawing from the Dynamics series is reshown as a human machine in the high dam, which towers over the causeways and towns of the New Nile, and solitary figures shown walking along its concrete embankments, completely void of any sign of habitability of vegetation in that painting. Well, another way to look at this is Sunal Ibrahim's novel Star of August, Nejma Augustus, written over an interim of 7 years, begun in 1966 and completed in 1973. It opens with a journalist's train ride to Luxor in Aswan, where the journalist settles into his routines and makes acquaintances in the town. The drudgery of life is brought out. The isolation of the project of the workers' hometowns is reinforced in the protagonist's conversations with local officials and project engineers. Ibrahim offers a semi-conscious string of impressions of the various levels of labor, Russian and Egyptian supervision. What I'm showing here actually on the right is an earlier work he collaborated on as a journalist in the book in Asad Ali, the Men of the High Dam. There's this kind of gendering in these works at the time. You see this kind of beginning of a kind of male patriarchal view of these projects. But I'm showing you a sample of Al-Ghazar's preparatory drawings of the same project about the same time. And you get the kind of questioning by the journalists of the project. This, on the right, this book was actually commissioned by the state to send journalists and illustrators as a collaborative project. This is what the state sort of expected, and what they got were rather subversive titlings of chapters, you know, a struggle, you know, Maraka وسؤال بلا الإجابة, you know, knows no answer to the questions, right? It's rather subversive title is what they get back. And what I'm suggesting is this is a part of a broader theme that we saw in the arts in this time, right at the brink of the '67 war, and it will resonate in the aftermath of the war. There's many examples we could draw on here. Ibrahim, in his novel, what he does is he seems to have been personally dissatisfied with having collaborated on this journalistic project. He was paid by the state, and he begins writing his novels, the Star of August, as a kind of reaction against that. And he introduces characters and he begins questioning the entire project. And it's important because he began the project before the '67 war, and he ends it long after. So in his novel, he introduces Mahmoud Mukhtar, the Egyptian nationalist sculptor of the 1920s, this great Nahta figure, as the new Michelangelo and the archetype of the first Nahta. One of the characters even has a copy of Irving Stone's novel, Agony and Ecstasy, in his pocket. But at the unraveling of the Nasser period, and with at the end of the promise of a second Nahta, which is what Izzeldin Naguib had written about. Here we have subjugation of the Saidis, the Upper Egyptians. It continues throughout his novel. They're the ones chosen for the hardest and most dangerous of tasks. The Saidis are placed in the pit of the giant quarries that are being cleared by giant Russian machinery. Ibrahim's text, I believe, then recalls the encasing of dead workers that we saw in Alcazar's drawing earlier. These works are very much referencing each other. Well, so then we reach a crisis because, you know, Alcazar, of course, had died just before. He'd also died in '66, the year before the war broke out. How does this carry forward then once the war breaks out? Well, I think one way to look at this is 4 years after Alcazar's death, his friend and colleague Gamal al-Saghini returns to the subject of what he called the tree of life as a metaphor for state and civil society in his various copper plates that he works on. Just go forward. This is sort of an example. I'm just pulling a couple of how he had been experimenting with the theme of Shajara al-Hayat, the tree of life on the right. And you can see he's drawing very much, I believe you can really read the direct inspiration he's taking from in terms of iconography from someone like Gasbia Syri and Alexander will inform us much better thinking about how important Gasbia Syri is for this period. But you can kind of see the boys are copying the women here. And it's kind of interesting to me how the feminine during this period of crisis starts to come back. As these artists are questioning, they turn back to the feminine in many ways against authoritarianism or the problem of war. This is something he'd been experimenting before the crisis years broke out. I'll just move on. This is Alcazar's famous painting, El-Mithaq, of the Charter, which plays with the title of Nasser's own project and book, of course. And you can read this in many ways. I think Amira Sonbal's discussion of this in the New Mamluks, I like her interpretation of this. It's the tree, it's Hathor, it's the goddess, it's a sick goddess. She's green, she's not a healthy looking figure. People read this in various ways. You can either read it as a defense of the state or as a subversive critique of the state. And I think if you look at the iconography, you can see that it goes back through what al-Saghini had been working on, what Gasbia Syri was working on earlier. I'm shortening because of time, but some ways we can look at this on that. So this is some of the contextual problem that we're wrestling with. And Gamal al-Saghini, who had been a close friend of Alcazar, is deciding to look at this and return and answer this form with a more textual certainty. And he begins inscribing into his copper plates. He wants to remove any ambiguity that we might see in that painting by Alcazar. And so the suggestion I'm giving here is that critical subversive implies a certain double meaning of iconographic and contextual context in both Alcazar and Al-Saghini's works. It allows us to re-examine critical theories of authoritarian modernism that Amira Sonbal saw, for instance, in Alcazar's paintings. For every artist and intellectual who embraced authoritarianism, there were counter-arguments and counter-positions adopted by leading and less prominent artists. And I think the number of artists imprisoned during the Nasser period attests to this kind of dissonance. Resistance could also be developed through analogy, whether it's in Alcazar's numerous private drawings or critical satires of the authoritarian state and militaocracy, some of his drawings, or in the texts we see like Sunala Ibrahim or Naguib Sarour. Now, what the choice then by Al-Saghini in representing the Arousa subject, the Arousa festival doll as a celebration and implied political commentary, Al-Saghini referenced the process by which the festival and its arts became a counter-discourse of resilience by popular culture. He draws upon the poetical refrains of the festival to merge text and image in his series of the festival tray. He develops this medium really over about a 15-year period from the mid-50s to about 1970. In one of his more provocative responses to the '67 war, Al-Saghini entitles one of the sculpted trays of the festival doll series, it's variously titled sometimes Arousa Salam, the Peace Bride, sometimes referred to or translated as the Sweet Bride, because here we have the circular tray. This is from 1967. The circular tray is presented in the form of a traditional food tray, tapped copper with raised and beveled edges. The main figure, the bride doll, wears an unfolded paper crown of the kind commonly sold in toy dolls. Al-Saghini sets off his central bride figure with a square pattern of floriated decoration and text with the works of the title Al-Arousa Halwa. It's kind of hard, it takes a little use to read it, but around here, Al-Arousa Halwa, this floriated text, very distinctive patterning he has here. And then he sets it off with 4 quadrants of an anti-war poem around the central figure of the Arousa doll. The sweet bride holds a snake, the serpent of war, in her left hand while tearing off an umbilical cord with her right hand. Al-Saghini's distinctive, inventive script is written in a hieroglyphic form of Arabic, how Egyptian, right? With each of the letters disconnected from each other, each quadrant and stanza cascading downward. The poem explains the intent of the work as a statement of grief for those who have fallen, the loss of vanishing ordinary festival in parts of it here, right? So you have to read each character coming down this way. And so we can read through and read the elements there, the repeating of Harb Salam, or here we have Salam, Harb, mother of peace, mother of war, repeating. And another one of the stanzas, Fein al Beit al Tadin, Fein al Eid al Tadin, where is the fallen festival, where is it gone? He answers, Fein, where? Harb fi insan, war for humanity, wa fi kul, wa kana harb, for all, for war. So he's questioning here in this reaction to the impact of the war itself. His sculptures, paintings of the Arousa Festival doll, choice of alternating textual commentary, affirmations of the festival, indicating his quest for an art that related to the contemporaneity of life with its various forms and philosophies of traditional arts and the transition as intermediaries of modernity. This is very much his kind of solution we saw with the contemporary art group, where you try to draw on traditional forms. Chopin, and I'll try to get to closing here on this one. And I think, this is very typical of this pattern of solution in this group that he belonged to. In his later works, we see here in this work, 4 years later in 1970, Al-Saghini revives the subject of the Tree of Life as a metaphor for the state and civil society. And Anas Abuzata, the simple people from 1970, he divides the composition in 2 halves. On the left, the living tree of good society, nurturing bird-like humanity, arts, science, medicine, health, prosperity. On the right, the tree of death and bad society, death, bombing, disease, unemployment, torture. And he inscribes, it's got to read through, it's a little tricky at first, but once you get used to his inscriptions here, you can see Jamal, Intaj, production, all the good signs on one side, and destruction on the right. In this work, al-Saghini provides an extended commentary of his view of contemporary Egyptian society. Hopes that resonated in his earlier works from 1958 and some of his similar sculptures of an all-encompassing goodwill are now replaced by his pessimism. The forces of good and evil are depicted as divisive conflict and reflect an internal civil struggle. He refers both to his own and Alcazar's work, incorporating and repeating the trope of the living and dying tree as a metaphor of state and civil society. So it's an allegory of good and bad government, moral guidance. He will return to this later in other works. After the 73 war, he collaborates with two prominent sculptors, Salah Abdel Karim and Mansour Faraj, on a proposed but never built memorial at the mouth of the Suez Canal for following the October War. It kind of shows his ambivalence about the state in many ways at that time, because earlier, back in '62, he rejected an official prize by the state. He also went through a certain personal crisis at one point where he dumped a bunch of these trays into the Nile River from one of the bridges. He just threw his artwork away into the Nile, never to be seen again, right? Because they wouldn't take his work into a museum. So he went through some sort of personal crisis. He goes on to Qatar. In 1976, writes a catalog on Qatari art, Final Tashkili Qatar, and then basically retires in Spain. What I'm suggesting, if we look at this period following the '67 war, dissidence in the art took new forms. The simpler model of state and intellectual dialogue, always tentative, ideological, and reliant on a nationalist base, could no longer presume an intellectual production that would be as cooperative. As a consequence, this left a number of projects and topics that avoided the direct discussion and articulation of peasant, tenant, migrant labor issues as collective problems. The arts as for society, the post-Nasser period confronted the open-door policy of the Sadat regime of the '70s, and we see a number of artists begin to really question and represent the problems of alienation that period represents, and there are many good examples that we can look at that reflect that alienation in a different form. So leave that for discussion. I probably want to move on. I apologize. Thank you.